Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for analyzing the economic impacts of the coronavirus. My name is Joe Dembski, and I'm moderating this IMPLAN webinar today. Before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and cover a few housekeeping items. You may post a question at any point during the presentation today using the chat box on your screen. Our hosts will spend the final 15 minutes of the presentation today addressing any questions coming in. Additionally, this presentation is being recorded, so you will have the ability to go back and review the presentation after the fact. Also, the presentation slides will be available for download along with the recorded version of this presentation. Today, you'll hear from our Chief Economist, Jenny Thorvaldson, and our Technical Product Manager and Economic Consultant, Jimmy Squibb. In the next hour, we're going to discuss an overview of economic impact modeling, cover relevant economic impact analyses with coronavirus examples, show you what modeling an economic stimulus would look like, and look at the environmental data that we have linked to these economic impacts. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jenny and Jimmy and start by asking if they can give us an overview of economic impact modeling and ask what role do models like IMPLAN play in quantifying the effect of COVID-19 on the economy?
Thanks, Joe. It's worth mentioning at the outset that no model can predict all of the wide-ranging short and long-term impacts of such a far-reaching phenomenon as the COVID-19 pandemic. But in this webinar, we're going to demonstrate some ways you can examine what is happening in the US and your community using input-output models, also known as IO models. By quantifying the economic relationships between all the actors in an economy, meaning industries, governments, households, etc., input-output models can be used to trace the wider economic impacts across various regions and various industries of a given initial impact in one or a few specific industries, such as a decrease in full-service restaurant output, for example. By halting their purchases of inputs, the closure of these restaurants has downstream effects on other businesses in other industries. Similarly, by laying off workers, those previous employees will have less disposable income to spend on still other businesses. Input-output models trace all of these relationships and therefore can estimate these ripple effects.
And here's why one might want to evaluate economic impacts of coronavirus with an input-output model. It's clear, for example, that when bars and restaurants are shut down, those industries will suffer. But an input-output model like IMPLAN can show what other industries will suffer indirectly as a result. And knowing this could help policymakers target assistance in anticipation of losses. Also, policymakers can get a sense of the extent to which stimulus programs might mitigate the adverse effects of business reductions and closures. Additionally, one can see how changes in economic activity in a neighboring state or city will affect your region. So there are many types of economic models that could be used to speak to the coronavirus, including, for example, general equilibrium models and econometric models, each of which has its advantages. The main advantages of IO models are data detail in terms of industries and regions, relatively low user data input requirements, and straightforward, easy to communicate assumptions. And disadvantages include assumptions of constant behavioral patterns, unlimited supply, and fixed proportional production functions. And whether these assumptions are acceptable depends on the context. For examining short-term impacts of industry shutdowns, changes in consumer spending, fiscal stimulus, and changes in trade levels in recession-like conditions under which there is excess capacity in most of the economy, using an input-output model is a reasonable way to assess regional economic impacts. And some advantages of IMPLAN as a specific input-output model and our US data is that we have data for 546 industries and corresponding commodities. IMPLAN models county-to-county trade and commuting flows, which allow one to see how changes in one region have ripple effects on other regions. We also show consumer spending by detailed commodity and by each of 9 household income levels. Besides the US, we provide models for 5 US territories, as well as some international models. Geographies of varying levels can be combined to create any region of interest, for example, metropolitan statistical areas.
Excellent. So with all that established, Jenny, where do you actually start with running an analysis of a coronavirus-related impact?
Well, as Jimmy pointed out, one does not need a lot of information to run an analysis in IMPLAN. If you know the industry being affected and either the expected loss of revenue or the expected loss of employment, this is enough information to run an impact analysis in IMPLAN. For example, if you know the expected loss of revenue and enter that into IMPLAN, IMPLAN will fill in the remaining variables for that industry, the associated employment with that, expected loss of revenue, the loss of labor income associated with that loss of revenue, and it'll fill that in for you based on all the data, the detailed data that we have for each industry and region. So in this next screenshot, we'll show you some of the detailed data we have for these industries in IMPLAN and how that's done. So here you can see just a small snippet of some of the industries we have, and we've got all these variables for those industries. So, and we can, knowing this information, if you come in with a specific output number, we can associate with that output an associated employment number with that, and a number of employee compensation and proprietor income, because we have all that, those relationships for each industry. We know, for example, here you can see that we've listed employment, output, employee compensation, proprietor income, other property income, and taxes. And so we know how much employment is associated with each dollar of output for a given industry in a given region. So when you put in your output number, IMPLAN will estimate for you the employment number that goes with that, and the labor income number that goes with that, etc. Now, of course, if you happen to have estimates for both revenue and employment, IMPLAN allows you to specify both of those. It's still a single analysis, just with 2 known data points to kick it off. So you can have more than one known piece of information that you put in there. It's just that you really only need one to really kick it off. So what you do is, based on what you know, you choose a certain event type. So in the next screenshot, we show you where you would actually enter your number. And here you can see in this drop-down menu that you have various things you can choose to kick off or to set up this activity. So here you would choose, in our example, we only knew the decrease in restaurant output. So we're going to choose industry output, and we would put in our number for that. If you only knew employment, you would choose the industry employment type and put in your employment number. And again, IMPLAN will fill in the rest of the variables for you, and you can customize those if you would want. Now, just to be clear and make sure that you know, you don't need to separately model an output loss and a jobs loss. Those are both parts of a single analysis. You're losing output and you're losing jobs. So those you wouldn't run those as 2 separate things. They're just part of one analysis.
Excellent. So setting these up seem fairly straightforward, but what about the data itself? You know, it's difficult to anticipate the exact direct impacts. You know, of course, you think about some industries are obviously going to experience negative effects. In fact, most will experience negative impacts, but you know, there might be some that might experience positive, such as like medical supplies manufacturing.
That's right, Joe. And the more of these different direct effects you can model at once, the closer you'll get to a true net impact. But you pointed out what is usually the hardest part of analysis is coming up with those direct impacts and where to get that information. So you may not be able to gather enough information on all the sectors that are likely to take a direct hit, or you may be only interested in one or a few particular industries for your region. And this is fine, so long as you communicate your results as being just one piece or aspect of the larger economic impact picture.
All right, so as I mentioned, the types of events that Jenny described can be run nationwide or in any combination of states, MSAs, congressional districts, zip codes, and counties. And you can also build custom regions that are combinations of those. So IMPLAN is located in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And last week, restaurants in our state were restricted to takeout and delivery only, and bars were closed. So in our example here, we want to account for what's happening throughout the state, but to focus on the consequences just for Mecklenburg County. And we also will include South Carolina to see the effects on South Carolina of changes that occur in North Carolina. So the setup is Mecklenburg, where IMPLAN is, and as one region, the rest of North Carolina as another region, and then South Carolina as a third region in what we call a multi-regional input-output analysis, or MRIO analysis. And this will allow us to specify different or the same events for each region, as well as to filter our results for any of the three regions. So to start, we're going to do a model of lost restaurant operations, including a 100% shutdown of full-service restaurants, a 50% reduction in limited service restaurants, and an 85% reduction of all other food and drinking establishments, which includes bars and catering. And these are just illustrative levels. You should, of course, use your own judgment and data in your own analysis. We will model all three of these changes as events that happen both in Mecklenburg County and the rest of North Carolina. But again, we are linking South Carolina in the model, but not modeling any direct changes in South Carolina so that we can see an example of regional spillovers. So events that happen in Mecklenburg County will have an effect on all three regions, as will events in the rest of North Carolina, which is one of the advantages of multi-regional analysis. And the percentages you see here correspond to our assumed changes. So let's see some results of that preliminary step. Here we're showing you effects on employment from the three restaurant shutdown events. We could break these out by industry, but we have summed them here for easy viewing. We could also show changes in sales or changes in regional GDP, among other variables. The results viewer in the software allows you to filter by affected region, by specific events. So there are three events here. You could isolate just one, as well as by type of impact. In the first row, it's labeled direct, is the lost employment just in the restaurants from their shutting down. The second row, labeled indirect, shows the employment lost in each region because the restaurants now are spending less on goods and services. The third row, labeled induced, shows the employment lost by virtue of employees of those restaurants and employees of the suppliers of those restaurants who no longer are earning wages and therefore have reduced their purchases. It's important for you to note that the data in IMPLAN are annual, so a 100% shutdown corresponds to a year's lost output. We all are hoping this does not last a year, and if you wanted to model a shutdown for 3 months, which is a quarter of a year, you would do a 25% loss instead of a 100% loss. And we always recommend performing sensitivity analyses by adjusting your inputs and assumptions and then examining how that affects your results. Often the goal is not to get the exact correct answer, but to understand the range of possible outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. So I want to go ahead and jump in here with a couple of quick questions. One that came in about the industries. So we have a question here. Are the industries organized by NAICS codes?
Largely, yes. So we have 546 industries in the latest IMPLAN data, and they tend to map pretty cleanly to NAICS code. Sometimes it's one IMPLAN industry per 6-digit NAICS code, and there are about 1,000 6-digit NAICS codes, which is as detailed as the NAICS classification system gets. Sometimes there's more than one 6-digit NAICS code in an IMPLAN industry. There are a couple special, mostly government-related IMPLAN industries that don't map one-to-one with NAICS codes.
Excellent.
And I will just jump in to say, sorry to speak over you, Joe. I was just going to jump in to say we have bridges between NAICS and IMPLAN that we provide to users upon request as well.
Thank you all so much. So then also regarding the, so this is a really straightforward example with the restaurants. And I think a lot of people get that. I know in Mecklenburg County, we have, I believe, as of today, almost 200 cases of the coronavirus, and the restaurants have been shut down for at least 2 weeks. So that as of right now, we're actually in a stay-at-home order. But I know presumably there's money that's, even though people aren't spending as much money at restaurants, or restaurants are being closed, presumably there's money still being spent somewhere. I know, speaking for my family, even though we're not going out to eat, we might be spending more money at the grocery store, spending at other places. So what does that kind of look like then with running these type of modeling?
Good question. So as I'm sure you're aware, people are buying a lot more soap and sanitizer than they used to do. So we will use that increased purchasing of soap and sanitizer as an example to highlight one of the more advanced capabilities of IMPLAN and the usefulness of some of our detailed data. So let's assume that consumers will spend 50% more on soaps and sanitizers, but that business spending on those commodities won't change. So as you can see in a screenshot of household local commodity demand, you'll see commodities 3177 and 3178, and they cover soap and sanitizing products. Now, remember, all we're assuming here is an increase in household spending on these goods, but the total use of those goods includes non-household spending. But this is reporting just the purchases of soaps and sanitizers by households, by income class in the local area. And as an aside, as Jenny mentioned, our website will give mappings between NAICS codes and industry codes, and you can get a detailed sense of what belongs to any one of these IMPLAN commodities. So since IMPLAN shows estimates of household purchases from each industry or commodity within your study area, you can weed out business-to-business spending. Now, of course, business spending might be affected, but it's not in our example. And you can also isolate local spending versus imports, the latter of which would have no direct effect on your area. So we can use those values in the rightmost column as a starting point for how much household spending on soap and sanitizers is going to change. Households, of course, tend to purchase these things at stores, and if you model the purchases directly in the industry or commodity, it implicitly assumes that those purchases are made directly from the manufacturer. So the value here is just the value of the good itself in this case, and it doesn't include any retail markup. If you did also want to account for lost retail margins, IMPLAN can include that as well. And again, consider the time frame and adjust for fractions of a year. This level of purchasing by households is over the course of a year.
Excellent. So we've got another question here I want to jump into quickly, Jimmy, or Jenny. So this is regarding the model results for retail sectors. And so the question is there a way to display a change in gross proceeds for retail sectors? This person says it's their understanding that output for the retail sector is really the marginal dollar portions of gross retail proceeds. So do they have that correct?
So there are several different ways to do this based on what you know. That's right, the output data for any retail or wholesale sector, it just accounts for their margin on top of the goods sold. So modeling output events in there just models output. We have data, and the transformation can occur automatically in IMPLAN that if you know total amounts of money spent at a retailer that no longer will occur, you can tell IMPLAN that, and it can discount for what those goods are. If you don't know what the goods are, but you really just want to capture the retail effect. If you do know what the specific goods are, and you know how much they cost in a retail setting, then you can tell that to IMPLAN, and IMPLAN will adjust and reallocate the impact to the specific good as well as to the components of the markup, which include transportation, wholesale, and retail markups. So there are several different ways to get at that based on what data the user has.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Jenny, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that was excellent. Thank you, Jimmy and Joe.
Perfect. Thank you all. So we'll go ahead and bring it back. So just to summarize, and even talking about with the slide that's shown here on the screen with the commodity demand, our intention with showing this data is for you to understand how you can use some of IMPLAN's underlying data to inform your assumptions. But there would be other household expenditures changing as a result of all the shocks from COVID-19 on the economy. Jimmy, what about some of the other business closures we're seeing as a result of the other changes in the economy?
Okay, so let's say that we learn that clothing retailers in Mecklenburg County will lay off 100 workers, but that's all we know. We don't know the sales values or anything. In this case, we can create an industry employment event and give it a value of -100 for the 100 lost jobs. And again, the relationship between job count and revenue and spending is an annual one, so adjust accordingly. I should also mention that you should think of employment counts as job years. So if the effect of the layoff is only for 3 months, then that should be a loss of 25 jobs, not 100 jobs.
Excellent. So we've got one more question here that I wanted to touch on. So with the scale of these events different from usual events, does it introduce the possibility of double counting, negative effects for industries that are effectively shut down? So let's say that we close all the restaurants down. Doesn't the indirect impact of that assume an effect on the restaurant sector, which no longer operates in this area? How does the contribution event account for that?
Good question. So when you do an event where you specify this is a contribution analysis and is kind of meant to represent a shutdown of an industry, the model is adjusted so that there can't be any subsequent purchases from the shutdown restaurant industry in this example. So that helps you avoid double counting in a case like that.
Excellent. And so what about some of the industries that may be experiencing increases in the short term? I know that there's a lot of talk about toilet paper. People are buying every roll of toilet paper they can find. So what about modeling that type of economic bump?
Well, we do have data for sanitary paper product manufacturing sector. And as you said, people are buying a lot of that right now. But this spending likely will be offset by a reduction in spending later in the year. So the question for the modeler is whether the time frame is relevant for what you're trying to model. Maybe a shift in spending over 6 months or a year is relevant for you, but 2 or 3 months is not. It also depends on your area. For example, I read in the news that Georgia Pacific is ramping up its production, which would mean more jobs and raw materials, at least for some period of time. And that could be very important in your region, depending on how much paper product manufacturing there is there and what your time frame is. So the point is you have to think about context and what you're talking about when deciding whether to include something in an analysis.
We've talked a lot about changes in industries and household spending reacting to shifts in local economies over the past couple of months. But I know one of the biggest news items right now is this economic stimulus that's being talked about. So how would you take that into consideration with modeling this, or really can you take this into consideration when you're modeling these things?
Good question. You can take it into consideration. As we were preparing for the webinar, no set stimulus plan was in place. We've learned a lot more about it since then, but this example here should still be relevant. One idea for stimulus has been direct payments to people. So we could look at population data in IMPLAN or outside of IMPLAN, or household data, household counts also in IMPLAN. So For the sake of simplicity, in this example, we will assume each household gets a $1,000 check. And you can use detailed demographic data to build a more detailed picture, of course. So in a fiscal stimulus, often money from the government has to come from somewhere and therefore has some offsetting decrease in spending on other programs. However, we are modeling short-term effects with government spending financed by monetary activity and deficit spending. So it's reasonable to ignore offsetting effects in the short run. Also, due to excess capacity in most of the economy, such spending likely won't have a large effect on relative prices. So with that in mind, there are a couple options for how to model this sort of thing. First are household income events, as you can see on the screen. So identify a household income group and plug in the value of money they receive. So that in each of these cases, that's household count by income level times $1,000. And this will distribute spending and savings according to those households' ordinary spending patterns. Note, however, that when these household spending events are modeled simultaneously with the industry contribution analyses we used for the restaurant industry shutdown, households won't be able to spend any money on restaurants. And this is good insofar as it helps avoid double counting. You should also be aware that in these household spending event types, IMPLAN's model does not assume all spending is local, so it does account for out-of-area spending, but a user can edit this. Now, if you wanted to change households' buying patterns from the ordinary pattern, you could refer back to the detailed by commodity data on household spending that we showed you earlier, make adjustments to it, and then model several commodity events. But with all these events, I think we should look at the results. So here, again, you can see employment values, but there are also results available for lost sales, change in GDP, among other variables. And these results similarly can be viewed by industry so that you can get a sense of the magnitude of impacts in each industry, but we've summed them here and pulling the data from the software to make it easier to see. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the software does enable filtering so that you can isolate impacts on any particular region or of any particular event. As noted before, the indirect effects are from raw materials and services spending, and induced effects from workers' reduction of spending from lost income, and also from the government stimulus payments in this case. So in this hypothetical, the stimulus checks aren't nearly enough to offset the losses, but you should bear in mind that we did model an entire year's decline. And this, of course, remains a sample exercise, not IMPLAN's final word on how we think the coronavirus is affecting our county and state.
Jimmy, in IMPLAN, you mentioned that it isn't assumed that that consumers spend, households spend every dollar of money that they have. We have savings rates in there. So in this particular example, that when you ran it using the standard household spending patterns in IMPLAN, there was some saving assumption in there as well. Is that right? So not 100% of that $1,000 per every household was being spent.
That's right. And that income infusion for each income group would be distributed across commodities as well as savings based on data for each income group. So the savings rates will be different, the composition of spending will be different, and money that's saved won't be spent and won't create, in this case, further impacts. And also there will be imports from outside of the region which won't create any further impacts.
Great. And there is an option, a different activity type in IMPLAN where you can adjust those assumptions and have all of this money be spent. And basically no savings if you wanted to.
That is true.
So at this point, the effects we've all discussed have really been, they've been focused locally in North Carolina, Mecklenburg County, South Carolina, and felt within these local economies. But this is really obviously a worldwide pandemic, and it's affecting economies not just here but abroad. So what about economies that are relying on imports and exports, especially with foreign ports closing? Can you discuss that? And what about examining foreign countries' economies as well?
We have a couple different ways to address that. We do currently offer several country-level international models, but with less regional and industry detail than our U.S. models. In the U.S. models, you can see a region's estimated levels of foreign exports by commodity or by industry. So, for example, you could model a reduction in a region's foreign exports as one way to address changes in trade. And the next screenshot shows commodity trade with, this is Mecklenburg County's foreign exports, which is outside of the U.S., and then domestic exports, which would be exports to other parts of the U.S. by commodity.
And there've really been some striking images from China of clearer skies with manufacturing essentially shut down during this quarantine. And one could imagine you might have a similar effect here in the U.S. Is there any way or any environmental data that would be tied in with this type of modeling that we would be able to kind of quantify that?
Fantastic question. And yes, we do have some supplemental data. It's not part of the software as of yet, but we have data that show various environmental factors, such as various emissions of various greenhouse gases into the air, emissions of chemicals and other waste into water, etc., per dollar of output by industry. And the data are from the Environmental Protection Agency, and we have bridged them to IMPLAN sectors so that they can be applied to industry output impacts from IMPLAN, so that the environmental impacts associated with a given set of economic impacts can be estimated. So to clarify, these are coefficients of physical units per dollar of industry output. Thus, one would multiply an industry's expected change in output, which you would get from your IMPLAN results, by these coefficients to get an estimate of the associated change in emissions of various sorts that could be expected to accompany the change in output. So for one example, we pulled a data point here, and the data show that the light truck and utility vehicle manufacturing sector emits 9.363 grams of carbon dioxide into the air for every dollar of output of production, which suggests that a hypothetical decrease of $1 million in light truck and utility vehicle manufacturing output would be accompanied by a reduction of roughly 9.36 million grams of carbon dioxide emission.
Thank you for that, Jenny. So as we've mentioned previously, these examples are not intended to be an exhaustive look at the economic impact of COVID-19, but more so just some considerations for framing a study. Households are going to shift their spending. Some businesses will increase their production. Some will have to decrease in the short term and long term. And we know international trade will be impacted, and this stimulus will augment some of the decrease of spending and layoffs. But we're all learning what the exact impacts will be to the economy as a result of all these changes. Is there anything else that you all would like to add, Jenny and Jimmy?
No, Joe, thank you, though. We've focused on what we think are important short-term economic effects in states and counties, and we hope to have given you a framework for how to model them, and we hope this was helpful.
And I second
Thank
Jimmy's
you, Jimmy. Thank you, Jenny. So before moving on to Q&A, we want to go ahead and acknowledge that this is a massive disruption that's going on all around us, and we hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy. We thank you for giving us your time here today for this webinar. We have ended a little bit early, so it's all the better. We have more time to answer Q&A, and we've received a ton of questions, so we'll go ahead and jump right into that. So the first thing that I've got here is there a way to find the number of households in each income category in IMPLAN?
Yeah.
The short answer is yes. When you open up a model kind of in the regions viewing page, there's a small demographic data section which gives household counts by income category, as well as population and land area, I believe. But good question. And that's what we relied on for the modeling of the stimulus checks here.
Excellent. So in the Mecklenburg County restaurant closing example, are there default employment numbers in IMPLAN, or does the user have to enter the initial employment numbers?
So we have employment for that sector for the given year. And so the user needs to come either with an employment number if they have an estimate, or a percentage change is what you can do. If you don't have an employment number, some sort of assumption that 50% of the employment there's going to be a reduction of a certain percentage. Or if if you think they're going to completely shut down, then you can just put in 100% there. But as Jimmy was pointing out, do be careful with the time frame on that. Jimmy, did you have anything to add to that?
No, thank you though.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Is industry contribution of negative 100% the same as zeroing out total output for that industry in the study area? In other words, if total output for industry in a study area per the model is $10 million, then running a negative $10 million industry output. If not, how is that different?
It's almost the same. So I will say sometimes when people say zeroing out, they're not referring to conducting an impact, but referring to kind of restructuring the model. But if I think the way the question is phrased is talking about what's the difference between reducing it 100% and then plugging in kind of a negative output value without doing the contribution analysis. The main difference there is the contribution analysis event type cues the model to restructure the way that what industries are able to buy and the multipliers, so that there's no longer any feedback effects on restaurants. Because if you're modeling shutdown of all of the restaurant industry, by definition it's impossible that then there would be further impacts on the restaurant industry, because it can't get any bigger than it was if it's gone or shut down. So that's the main difference. It's subtle, but it does have some effect on the multiplier effect for every industry.
And if I might just add to that, so if you were to run it as a normal impact analysis, not a contribution analysis, and you ran a negative amount of the entire output for the restaurant industry, in the results, you would also see indirect and induced negative impacts on the restaurant industry, such that the total negative impact on that sector would be larger than the actual current output of that sector, which is kind of impossible, is what Jimmy was pointing out. And so it's very important in cases like that, where you're reducing something by 100% or even just a very high percent. If you're getting much above 50% reduction, we usually recommend doing a contribution analysis. And then in that case, it limits you won't see any indirect or induced impacts on that sector. So there's no double counting is the key there.
So going back to the restaurant example again, why is the direct impact in North Carolina larger than in Mecklenburg if all the restaurant closings are occurring in Mecklenburg County?
So sorry if I wasn't clear about that at the beginning, but we put the closure of restaurant events in both Mecklenburg County and in the rest of North Carolina. So it's bigger just because there are more restaurants in the rest of North Carolina than in Mecklenburg County.
Thank you, Jimmy. So are we able to calculate what the loss would be in intermediate outputs as far as your supply chain?
It's a pretty general question, so I'm going to answer it the way I understand it, but if you can clarify, that helps. So when you model any kind of change, the item tagged as indirect effects are changes that come from stopping supply chain purchases. So yes, we can kind of identify the effect of reducing purchases of something because that's kind of the fundamental heart of the model, is the inter-industry purchases and what industries buy from other industries. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but Jenny, do you have any added thoughts?
I interpreted it the way you did, Jimmy. I would just say, ask the person to clarify if we didn't answer it, and just to point out that those industry-specific impacts that can be seen in IMPLAN, and as Jimmy said, that is the strength of an input-output model, is to see those, and we just didn't display those anywhere in the presentation today. We showed the summary impacts, which is just the sum across all the industries, but those can definitely be viewed in detail.
Thank you. So this person says they represent 4 counties in New York State and foresee a need to compute analyses along with the examples that we spoke of today. And they're looking for any guidance on an area to focus on for analysis. So should they, for example, focus it within counties, or with individual counties, within an MSA, or within a multi-county area?
I'll take a first stab at this, Jimmy, if you don't mind.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to point out that that's one of the biggest strengths of that multi-regional input-output analysis that Jimmy showcased and mentioned. Is before MRIO, it was a harder decision to decide on your study area, because if you want to capture the impacts on the rest of the state or the rest of a county, you really had to just choose that larger study area as your study area, and then you're kind of losing your regional detail. And with MRIO, you can really focus your direct impacts on that very specific 4-county region, and then link that model to whatever other region, surrounding regions you want. So you could do it to the rest of the state, you can do it to several states around, etc. And then you're keeping your regional specificity by putting the direct impacts in that 4-county region, and then still see the ripple effect in neighboring regions or surrounding regions. Really, it's up to the analyst and the intended audience, and often it is really helpful to show your neighboring counties how activity in your region is affecting them. And that's really important between rural and non-rural regions, that to show and highlight the interdependencies between the two and how they both support growth in each other. So anyway, I kind of went a little bit off on a tangent there, but in terms of how to choose, I would just say try to use MRIO before you use a larger study area, so you can keep the specificity. And Jimmy, what were you going to say, and what would you add?
No, I agree with that. I think, ask yourself, how detailed can I be when I specify the impacts? Do I know what's happening in this county versus that county, or just what's happening across all the counties that I care about? And also ask yourself, how detailed do you want to be able to filter your results from the impact? And then in general, it's better to be more detailed and link more regions, but there are kind of decreasing returns to that. If you link Montana, it'll change things, but it'll be by a very, very small amount, at a cost of some probably unnecessary analytic complexity. But I agree with what you said, Jenny. Thank you.
We have a question here regarding tax. So can an analysis like this quantify impacts on sales tax, as in like sales tax loss as the result of a tourism decline?
Jenny?
Short answer, yes. I'll let Jimmy elaborate. He's our in-house tax guru.
I don't know about that, but yes, we do. So as I was showing you results by employment, and had mentioned that you can do GDP results as well as sales results, we also have tax impact results. And then that's broken out by types of tax, like sales tax, property tax, personal income tax, and then those tax impacts are broken out by level of government. So state governments, county governments, city governments, and then special districts that are like public school districts or fire districts. Basically, it's a function of the way our source data sets are structured. But yes, IMPLAN will give you an estimated value for the tax impact. We have a pretty lengthy document about it on our website. I'd recommend that you take a look at that.
Excellent. So this is in relation to the international data. Does IMPLAN model sectors in Canada or the UK?
Yes, we have Canadian models. I think this is, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many sectors there are, but I think we have different iterations of Canadian models from data from Canada's National Statistics Center, StatCan, as well as from the OECD. The former has somewhat around 100 sectors and the latter in the 30s. And some of the earlier data that's in more sector detail, we have some province level models for. And then the UK, I believe we have a model based on the OECD in our desktop software platform. So all the examples we showed you were from IMPLAN Online. We also have developed a data set internally that has UK 64 sectors, but then a lot of regional detail. A regional classification system used in the EU is national territorial specifications NUTS level. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I know there are over 100 regions into which we've broken up the UK, but that's not available in the software yet. We do sell that as kind of a separate data set. So it requires a good bit more work to deal with, but you have all the same level of detail you do in another model.
Excellent. Another one related to the other pieces of data. So is the environmental data available with our data purchases now or for an additional expense? And is that in the cloud software, the IMPLAN software that was displayed today?
It is not in the software as of yet. That is a longer term goal of ours at IMPLAN. Right now, we would just provide it in a spreadsheet form. And I will just have to defer the selling the price question, part of that question, to somebody else, because that is not a decision that I make. And I think we haven't made it widely. We haven't widely advertised that data set just yet because we're just so excited to get it into the software eventually. But we would love to get those data into your hands. And I don't know if Devin's on the line and wants to speak to that anymore.
I would say thank you, Jenny, and I'm sure that I imagine that Devin would be happy to have a conversation with anyone that is interested in it, but probably take it offline.
All right.
So we have a few more here, and we'll start with this one. There's some questions about the difference between an economic impact and an economic contribution, because we've kind of talked about both things today. Can you all help just explain that a little bit further?
Sure. I'll do that. Jenny, you can add something after I've given my response. So economic impacts typically are when you're modeling some addition or some new change, new demand for goods, say, in a region, and contributions are usually to examine the effect of something that, say, an industry that already exists in the region. That's kind of the fundamental difference, and then they involve different methods used under the hood, but that's the primary point of difference between them, I think.
Excellent. So are you able to identify states and areas with the greatest or least dependency on air travel and other consumer-based spending? So is there a data set that would help someone be able to identify that?
Our study area, so I guess you should measure dependence in several different ways, but IMPLAN study area data that you can view through the software would show the size of air transportation as a sector in IMPLAN. So it would show the size of that sector in any study area. And if that's what you mean, that's kind of enough. It also shows what the demand for air travel services are in an area, whether that's demand for locally produced air transportation services or for air transportation services provided elsewhere. So yeah, I think it can be very instructive for showing an area's dependence on that sector.
And that could also be broken out into household demand for that sector versus industry demand for that sector as well.
Thank you all very much. We are nearing the end of our time window here, and we've received an overwhelming number of questions, and we want to make sure we get to all of them, even if we don't get to them on air. So if you didn't get your question answered, we will reach out in the next few days to ensure that your question is answered. We've actually received a lot of questions with people with very specific situations they're looking to get some information on. So we will be following up in the next few days to make sure that question is answered and you have the information there that you need. If you were unable to get your question answered or entered in the chat box, please feel free to reach out to us at support@implan.com. And as I said, we will happily address any of those questions. I also want you to keep an eye out for an email with a recording of today's presentation, as well as some additional resources related to running coronavirus impact analyses in IMPLAN, as well as with that will be the slides from the presentation here today. And I want to go ahead and address one of these specific questions that we got, and this will be the final one today. So Jenny and Jimmy, for you all, for trade impacts, is the model considering trade that is strictly originating or destined to the study area, i.e. manufacturing, or does it also consider all industries related to trade that is passed through, i.e. warehousing, trucking, customs, brokerage, professional services, etc.? In this latter case, would the input be total loss of trade passing through, or could this type of impact only be done by inputting the direct impact on individual industries?
That is an excellent and detailed question. And the answer is a little complex because, when we were discussing, you can kind of think about it the way you think about retail sectors. Like you have the good itself, and then there's those kind of transportation, wholesale, and retail margins tacked onto that. So with imported or exported good, there's the good, and then there's port services and customs and so forth. So we don't have in the software kind of for a given traded good the additional kind of trade, like foreign trade related margins that you're talking about. So the study area data for an area shows kind of activity that's related to facilitating trade, as you mentioned, but doesn't necessarily tie some portion of that one-to-one with traded goods. So you'd have to do some analysis kind of on your own, and also referring to model data to be able to piece that together how you want. Jenny, do you have anything to add to that?
No, thank you, Jimmy. Good answer.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank everyone once again in attendance here today. As I said, keep an eye out for contact from us with the recording of today's webinar, as well as supplemental materials. And anyone that did not get a question answered here today, we will reach out very, very shortly with all those answers to those questions to make sure that you get all the information you need. I want to thank you again for taking the time out today to join us for this webinar today on analyzing the economic impacts of coronavirus. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.